Let's now take a look at the tissues that surround and protect the brain. And a lot like the layers surrounding the spinal cord, you can work your way superficially towards the brain. So, moving towards the brain, you could go through skin, right? There would be skin of the scalp. We would then penetrate through one of the bones that form the cranial cavity, whether it be the frontal bone, parietal bones, temporal bone, occipital bone, and then we would reach the dura mater. Now, notice that we wouldn't have any epidural space. So, unlike the spinal cord where there's that layer of adipose tissue, that's not found surrounding the brain. So, no epidural space around the brain. So, that's one major difference. Another one is with the dura mater. So, the dura mater actually separates in different locations and forms what's known as a dural venous sinus. So sinus is kind of like a cavity, dural meaning in the dura, and then venous is in reference to veins. So these dural venous sinuses kind of function like veins of the brain. So they're going to be collecting the deoxygenated blood that just delivered oxygen and nutrients to the brain itself. So you'll notice where the dura mater separates, there's two layers. There's the periosteal dura, which is basically the layer in contact with the bone. And then there's the meningeal layer, or meningeal layer. That's the layer that's in contact with the next layer, or the middle layer, which is the arachnoid mater. So you have a little bit of difference here. You've got no epidural space. You got two layers of the dura, which form dural venous sinuses. Then you have the arachnoid. Then you have subarachnoid space. Now remember why the subarachnoid space is so important. That's where you're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. And then you hit the pia, which is directly attached to the brain. If we did another type of section here, this would be kind of a coronal section. We see these sinuses where the dura separates. It forms these sinuses that collect that deoxygenated blood. And they all have different names. You'll notice this one's called the superior sagittal sinus because it's up top, right, in between or down the midline. And then here is the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, so that brings us to cerebrospinal fluid. Let's talk a little more detail about it. We kind of introduced it in the spinal cord and spinal nerve chapter. We talked about the fact that it's found in the subarachnoid space and it's down the central canal of the spinal cord. Well, it's produced up in the brain. And if you recall from the previous chapter on nervous tissue, we already learned what cells produce it, the ependymal cells. And they're found in a tissue called the choroid plexus. So basically, a choroid plexus is ependymal cells and capillaries. All right, and these capillaries receive arterial blood. Arterial blood is the blood going up to the brain in arteries. All right, so for example, you might have heard of carotid arteries. So this blood has oxygen and nutrients. So this is the good stuff, right? Arterial blood has the oxygen, the nutrients that is required for organs to function. Well, the ependymal cells found in this tissue, called the choroid, takes that blood and extracts the fluid. So we don't need the cells. We leave the red blood cells, the white blood cells, we leave platelets in the arterial blood, but we take the fluid, the plasma. And in that plasma, there's nutrients like glucose, there's electrolytes like sodium and potassium and chloride and calcium. So we basically use that to make cerebrospinal fluid. And these tissues, these choroid plexus, are found in cavities inside the brain known as the ventricles. So this drawing is showing cavities, all right? And these cavities are full of cerebrospinal fluid. And you'll notice there's 4 of them. There's 2 that kind of look like these arc-shaped cavities called the lateral ventricles. So those would be in the 2 hemispheres. So each cerebral hemisphere has a lateral ventricle. So that would be two. Then they connect to a third ventricle called the third ventricle, which is basically in the diencephalon. Then there's a little tube that connects to the fourth ventricle. And this little tube is called the cerebral aqueduct. Aqueduct is basically like a duct for water, but instead of water, it's actually cerebrospinal fluid. Then you'll notice it can leave the fourth ventricle and go down the central canal, and then it also gets into the subarachnoid space, which surrounds both the brain and the spinal cord. So these are the locations where you find cerebrospinal fluid circulating. Remember, this stuff has to move, and it moves because the ependymal cells have cilia. So it's found in the four ventricles. It's in the subarachnoid space, both around the brain and the spinal cord, and it's down the central canal. What is the function? Physical protection. So your CNS is basically floating in a layer of liquid, so it can absorb any kind of shock if you bump your head or something like that. It also distributes nutrients and electrolytes. So that's kind of like a function of blood, right? Distributes the nutrients and the electrolytes. And then it also helps to remove waste, all right? Just like blood. So it kind of functions a lot like blood in that it provides, things that brain and spinal cord need. Then, just like blood, right, it's going to kind of run out of nutrients. It's going to kind of accumulate waste. So what do you do with it? You put it back into circulation, but you put it into the venous blood. That's the blood that's eventually going to leave the brain or leave the spinal cord. And that's the job of another tissue type called the arachnoid villi. All right, it's actually a component of the arachnoid mater. Where does it put this fluid? It puts it into the dural venous sinuses. Again, those function a lot like veins in that they're going to remove that blood and deliver that blood towards the heart. All right, that's what veins do. They bring blood towards the heart. All right, so cerebrospinal fluid produced by the choroid in the ventricles circulates through the ventricles down the central canal in the subarachnoid space, serves its purpose, protection, deliver nutrients, remove waste, then goes back into circulation by the arachnoid villi. This is kind of an all-encompassing slide for cerebrospinal fluid. It kind of summarizes everything that the previous slide kind of talked about, but here's where you start with this kind of flow diagram, arterial blood. So that comes up towards the brain. Again, carotid arteries, for example. That blood enters the choroids of all of the ventricles, choroid plexus. That tissue, because the ependymal cells produces cerebrospinal fluid, that goes into the ventricles and then circulates through the ventricles into the subarachnoid space, and then eventually gets put back into the circulation at the dural venous sinuses. So this is kind of a flow diagram. This is showing where this occurs. So this tissue here are the choroids. All right, this is that tissue, and then they kind of show it over here. So here's the capillary, so that's going to have that good arterial blood. These are the ependymal cells, and they just extract the fluid and put it into the ventricle. So that would be this kind of yellow stuff here would all be cerebrospinal fluid. There's that little aqueduct to get down into the fourth ventricle. Then we can see it leave that fourth ventricle, and notice where it goes. It goes into that subarachnoid space that surrounds the brain. And then it goes down the central canal and in the subarachnoid space down the spinal cord. So where you see this kind of yellowish green color, that's all where cerebrospinal fluid would be found. Okay? All right, what else? Let's talk a little bit about what we call lateralization of the cerebral hemispheres. So basically what this means is there are certain things that the right side of the brain does, and there's certain things that the left hemisphere does. And there's kind of a list here for the right hemisphere, and then there's a list here for the left hemisphere. We can simplify it a bit. Okay, first and foremost, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and receives senses from the left side of the body. The left hemisphere receives senses from the right side of the body and controls muscles on the right side of the body. So the two hemispheres function contralaterally. All right, so they control the opposite side. That's one main point of this slide. The next are all these other traits, and I kind of summarize it down here. So notice that the right hemisphere does more insight, visual, spatial skills, intuition, musical, and artistic awareness. All right, so that's a little bit of what the right hemisphere is known for. The left hemisphere is more language, math, scientific skills, and logic. All right, so the take-home message of this slide is this first statement here, right, on each side, that they control and receive from the opposite side of the body. And then just some of these kind of traits that I've summarized down here. All right, next topic. Functional brain systems. Functional brain systems are basically a group of different parts of the brain kind of grouped together because they have a similar function. So, and we're going to talk about two of them. The first one's called reticular formation or reticular activating system. Basically, this includes all the parts of the brain that help just keep you alive. All right, they're just keeping you conscious and alert. That's known as reticular formation. A lot of those areas are found in the brainstem. All right, so the brainstem is often thought of as kind of your primitive brain. So that's the part of the brain that developed first, right? Just keep this organism alive. All right. Then, the higher level, like the frontal lobe, developed kind of later through evolution, because that's going to have your intelligence, that's going to have your decision making, that's going to have your personality, which are kind of that higher level function. So that's the reticular formation. Limbic system is often referred to as your affective brain or emotional brain. So that's going to be parts of the diencephalon, cerebrum. Its job is to recognize emotions. So it recognizes anger, fearful facial expressions. It also is used to assess danger. It has a lot of your fear response and your emotions. All right. So the key here, it plays a huge role in expressing emotions. All right. So it's also kind of connected to some other things. For example, food, the sense of smell and taste seem to affect the limbic system. So you can get very emotional from smells, and quite often eating food makes you pretty happy. So a lot of people will use food as kind of a way to treat, if they're depressed, for example, because food and smell can activate parts of the limbic system. It also helps establish memories. So if you think about your earliest memory, the reason why you remember that is probably because there was some emotional impact, whether that emotion was a positive emotion or a negative emotion. So the limbic system plays a role in establishing memory. It also plays a role in anxiety and distress, quite often when you're in pain. Pain is very emotional, right? It can affect emotions. A lot of people that develop depression, it can come from being in a chronic state of pain. A lot of people end up taking, medication to treat the pain, but also medication for depression. So, two functional brain systems, reticular formation, so this is just keeping you alive, conscious and alert. Limbic system has a lot of your emotional effects, as well as helping to establish memories. All right, the next video we're going to go through the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves, there's 12 pairs of them. We often will use Roman numerals as well as their actual nerve name. And then we're going to learn kind of some other things to remember. All right, so that's the kind of the end of the brain. The last video is going to be going through these 12 cranial nerves.